So a couple more tools for you. The first one is a SWOT, which stands for Strength, Weaknesses, Opportunities, Threat. You're trying to get a snapshot of different dimensions of your organization. So the strengths and weaknesses are often used to describe internal aspects of the organization. So what do we already do quite well? So you can do this at a macro level, like just generally speaking in our organization, what are we really good at? You can also do it around a particular initiative. So some of you are thinking about like math curriculum, you know? Like what do we already know about how we implement curriculum, you know? So you can do it at different grain sizes. But the basic idea is to harvest those strengths. And I remember some of you, when we got together in November in our first session, and we were talking about 5 whys and after action reviews, were saying like, this seems kind of deficit focused. Like, why are we talking about all the stuff that's like hard as the place to start? And I think about all of those as opportunities for learning, but sometimes I tend to focus more on the stuff that's not working as well. The SWOT gives you this discipline of saying, we should build from our strengths too, because it's always easier to build from strengths than from weaknesses. So let's get those down. Now on the weaknesses side, like if we're being honest, what do we know about ourselves as an organization? What is just harder for us to do as an organization based on past history? What do we know? And about our current context, like what do we just know about what we've got in the organization right now around capacity and those sorts of things. So that's strengths and weaknesses. Now the other two dimensions, opportunities and threats, are more about the external environment often. And the idea with opportunities are, what are the things we can take advantage of? And I'll show you an example in just a moment. What are the kind of current conditions, potential things, potential resources we can take advantage of? And threats are very often from the outside. What are the pressures, things that are getting in our way potentially from the outside or could make this harder to do, or creating an environment that's harder for things to do? And as you'll see in the example I'm about to show you, sometimes things show up in both columns. You know, it can be an opportunity and it can be a threat. It all depends on how we navigate it. And often mandates fall in that category, things that are kind of coming at you from the outside. So that's a kind of rough sketch. Now let me take you through an example. Rachel Curtis and I made a SWOT to go with the Morewood example that's in the strategy and action book. So it's not actually in the book because we made it after we developed the book and we're out in the field working with people and we realized, you know, a SWOT could be helpful for people in just taking a step back and harvesting what's already working for them about their organization. So we made this one that's consistent with the storyline of Morewood in the book. So if you're wondering, like, where does this come from, you can look at pages 120 to 122 in the book and you'll sort of see that storyline. So what in this school system that's in strategy and action, what did they see as some of their strengths? Well, they said, we've got strong senior leadership with big picture thinking skills. They looked at their team. They were like, we've got a lot of assets on the team. We've got a lot of teaching and learning expertise on this team that we can build from. We're currently building a formative assessment system, so we have that to work with. We're also developing scorecards, so we've got some different ways of measuring progress that we're working on. We also are creating a data warehouse, so we're getting all these systems for assessment in place. And we have really good work underway in math and science and curriculum and pedagogy, so there's got all this good stuff going on. Okay, weaknesses. Well, we don't really have a system-wide shared image of what good instruction looked like. Everybody's kind of operating on their own mental models. When we look at the curriculum, we would call it pretty low-level curriculum and instructional materials. So that's a weakness that we've got. We don't actually have a shared understanding of what a comprehensive support system for students would look like. Our vision, we have something written on paper, but honestly, it's not that audacious for kids. It doesn't make us get up in the morning. It's kind of ho-hum. We have all this assessment stuff, but we don't actually have a clear understanding across the district of how assessment really leads to improved instruction. When we assessed our strategy, we're like, we have a bunch of initiatives, but we don't really have a clear focused strategy. And that relates to we don't have a shared understanding system of our most important work. So that's kind of where we think we are with our strengths and weaknesses. With your colleagues on Wednesday when we did this, some of them were like, yep, some of that sounds familiar on both the strength side and the weaknesses side. So I don't know if you're experiencing that. On the opportunities, hey, we have a new educator evaluation system that's been given to us by the state. And look, it shows up on the threat side too. So it's an opportunity because it could actually really help us support teachers. Well, it's a threat because it also feels like it could be really overwhelming and distracting and not really help teachers at all. Pressure from the state to improve scores. You see, that shows up on both sides too, because that creates some fear, pressure that makes it hard for people to take risks. And at the same time, on the opportunity side, it actually creates some urgency that makes people more likely to move and change things. On the opportunity side, we've got new Common Core standards. We're trying to use those. We think that's going to help us with this rigor thing we're looking at. We've got a pretty new superintendent who's got quite a bit of support. That seems like an opportunity. And we got a grant to use technology, so we got some money there that we can use. On the threat side, we have a history of an unpredictable school board, so we're not exactly sure. You probably aren't sharing this document with the school board, but we're doing this internally. We're saying that. It's a really tight budget year. Our Race to the Top money is running out. Central office, when we ask people, like, in schools, do you feel supported by the central office? They say, not at all. We feel like you're an accountability mechanism. And big threat, not everybody inside and outside the system believes that children can learn at high levels. So our sort of starting assumption isn't widely shared. Okay, that's a threat. So there's their SWOT, and then they basically moved from that to trying to figure out where are we going to place our bets. So again, this is one of those tools you can use at kind of early stages to figure out where are we going to place our bets and what are we going to try to execute. Or you can use it kind of midstream in your execution to say, hey, what are we learning about our organization? What are the strengths that are bubbling up as we're trying to do this thing that we wrote this big plan for? What are the weaknesses that it's exposing? Where are the opportunities we're seeing? And where are the threats that are really kind of getting in our way when we're trying to do this? But the transparency of it, some people experience them as kind of cathartic too, because you're naming things like, especially on the weaknesses and threats side, you're naming things that people are experiencing and seeing, but sometimes they're an elephant that nobody wants to name, or sometimes just getting them out and saying, yeah, that is a threat. Like, what are we going to do with that? Or some people saying it's an opportunity and other people saying it's a threat exposes like, woo, we're experiencing the same thing kind of differently here. The other tool I wanted to share with you now is I've been thinking a lot in my own work around how do we capture learning over time? Because if you remember back to what we talked about with meetings, say, do a plus delta at the end of the meeting and use that to inform the next meeting. Great. But then how do you capture over time what you're learning across meetings? Or as last time we met, I was sharing with you some of the ways we were trying to keep track of a very complex project I'm involved in about launching online modules for system level leaders, and lots of people involved. And I showed you some ways we were trying to make the workflow work for people with the to-dos, and also what are we doing in meetings over time. But now those modules are happening. So they launched in mid-February. Now we're in learning mode, and we have these weekly learning loop meetings that are about what are we seeing in the weekly evaluation data? What are we learning? What do we need to adjust right now? What should inform the module that's in development right now? And what's going to inform the revision of this one? So there's a lot of learning to keep track of. And our question is like, how do we harvest that learning both for this project and also the organization that I'm in, the Harvard Ed School, is trying to learn how to do online learning well. So how do we harvest it in a way that's useful for the whole school? So we've been playing with some different ways of tracking learning over time so that everything doesn't feel like Groundhog Day all over again to us and everybody else, right? So one thing we've been experimenting with is kind of what I'm calling a plus delta running log. So not at the level of plus deltas that I shared at the beginning of this session where it's like, here's the gist of all of the feedback we got about the last session. But at a high level, what were some of the big takeaways of pluses, things to keep? What were some of the big takeaways of deltas, things to work on? And what's coming up for us about those things? What are ideas or questions we have? Like one from this series for me might be, people really want time to work on their own work, and they want time to connect with other people. That would be one to kind of keep in mind. And the question would be, how do we make sure that the time to work on your own work is really meaningful for people? How do we do that? So I might want to capture that, because whenever we do this sort of thing again, like we would need to figure that out, right? And then future actions is just a way of saying, and therefore, like, what are we going to do about that? We're just going to keep that in mind, et cetera. This particular one is coming up for me too, because there are some things in our organization that we do every year. So I told you that we just got done with admissions for this doctoral program that I run. Well, we do admissions every year, and we've got it down pretty well, but there are always things we want to adjust from year to year. And they range from really little things, like technical things, like we have a lot of evaluators involved, and they're evaluating a lot of different things during the day. So we end up collecting like 200 sheets of rating sheets by the end of the day. And as an evaluator, every year I sit down and I'm like, I'm getting confused with all my evaluation sheets. So about 3 years ago, we were like, we should put those on different color sheets of paper so people can just track like which activity they're in and make it easy. Well, we said that and then forgot to do it the next year, because it was like a whole year later and we forgot to do it. So last year we wrote it down, and we almost forgot to do it again this year, but somebody on my team were like, where was that list of things we made about stuff we wanted to remember? Oh, they opened it and they were like, put the evaluation sheets on different colors. And it was the day before they were going to get printed, and we caught it this year. We're like, great. So sometimes it's little technical things like that. How do you just get it in a place where it'll get used? And other times it's bigger picture things, like how, in admissions, how are we really assessing people we just have for the day, whether they're going to be a good fit? And here's what we experimented with, et cetera. So how are you and your organization tracking those things? The other thing we've been experimenting with in the online module project that I'm leading is what one of my colleagues called a change log. I'm a little bit allergic to the word change myself, so I kind of it was one of those things you just like roll with, your team took some initiative, like, okay, change log. And here's what we have in a Google Doc that anybody on our team can throw things into. So on the far left-hand column is basically like the description of the idea of the thing to change. And these range from teeny tiny little things to big ideas. And the idea is people just throw things into that column whenever it occurs to them. And right now, if I showed you the Google Doc, you would see that's the only column that's filled in. Like, we're basically just asking people, before you get too far away from the idea, just note it down there. And then over time, we're going to fill in, like, what was the evidence? What was the reason for that change? Is it because we thought of something? We got the feedback from participants. What was it? And then I said, when my teammate made this, I was like, that's great, but we're not going to be able to do all of those things. So we need some way of sifting through later and figuring out, like, which one should we do? So she put in a priority column, and there's basically high, medium, low. Like, how urgent do we think this is? And then when we go back later, which will be in another month or so, and we try to decide, like, which of these things are we adjusting, then we'll fill in for the ones we're going to do, who's responsible, what's the status, and the comments. So instead of having 4 different documents, like, here's what we learned, and then here's what we're going to change, we just put it all in one. So last time people said it was useful when I share, like, things I'm doing in my own work that are trying to address some really common challenges. So I thought I'd share those with you. But basically the idea is, how in your organization are you tracking over time the learning from doing something? And Gwen was sharing that to get ready for today, she actually pulled out agendas from past years, and that itself as an exercise was an interesting exercise in tracking learning over time, because you're looking at artifacts of your work from, okay, when we had meetings about, when our data team was meeting before, our PLCs were meeting before, what did the agendas look like 3 years ago? What were we talking about? What are we talking about now? And what does that tell us about what we're doing? So lots of different ways to do it, but your organization needs to figure out how to do it, or when people are like, we've done that before, they're probably right, and the organization hasn't figured out a way to name it and build from it. Right, there's an underlying theory of action here, which is, if you make the implicit explicit, that allows you to have conversations about it, and that in and of itself will lead to some changes. Checking assumptions, making adjustments of action. Most definitely. And that's why it's nice if you have people who bring some of those different perspectives to the table. So it's not, so somebody at the table will say, well, you guys think that you're very supportive, but it doesn't feel that way on the ground. Not that you're not working hard, but that's not how we experience you, you know?